The legacy of Quake and Half-Life is something with such a monumental effect that it's hard to even measure. It's influenced the existence of esports, the push for storytelling for shooters, the unbound freedom that Quake and Half-Life had in just the modding scene alone, as well as continuing to push 3D tech as a result of the blueprints that they provided. The first Quake was something that's held up in more ways than one, thanks to its dedicated multiplayer scene, its modding scene that has all sorts of mods ranging from total conversions to new maps, graphical and gameplay overhauls. It was also the game that spawned Team Fortress, that would eventually lead to one of the best multiplayer games ever made, Team Fortress 2. Quake's Team Fortress had the same principle of class-based gameplay, and each class had specific loadouts tailor-made for them. On the surface, it still somewhat looked like Quake, but at the same time it wasn't. It was the start of something different, and it would one day pay off immensely. In the case of Counter-Strike though, well, there's actually one game to thank for its existence, and it's a game that most people would never expect. And that game is Quake 2. Quake 2 was on the one hand a sequel, but also its own entity. It departed from the sci-fi fantasy world that was Quake 1, along with its Lovecraftian themes and monsters, and replaced it with a pure sci-fi setting. At its core, it was still a fast-paced shooter in the same way as Quake 1, but it also brought about improvements from graphics to physics, and to some extent gameplay. It also had a thriving modding scene as well, so much so in fact, that we would end up getting a mod that was not only completely different from any other shooter released from the 90s, but would also be the game that essentially gave birth to the idea of Counter-Strike thanks to the talent behind the wheel, Action Quake 2. This mod would be created by a mod team known as Akimbo Team Productions, or A-Team for short. It was a project heavily inspired by the John Woo films from Hong Kong. His movies would be all about straight up gunfights, rather than the plethora of martial arts films that seemed to exist everywhere at the time. Films like Hard Boiled, The Killer, A Better Tomorrow 1 and 2 would eventually launch him into the West, where he would make Face Off. The influence of these movies would give the team the idea to make a mod that reflects that same idea, but in Quake 2. You take out the sci-fi setting and its weapons and instead replace it with a modern day setting with modern day weapons. It would incorporate team-based modes, the same sort of fast-paced gameplay from Quake 2, on top of a few other mechanics that were unique to Quake at the time, such as bleeding wounds, sustained injuries affecting movement, locational damage, and recoil. This would add a level of realism to the game that was by nature a fast-paced FPS. And the setting was also something really refreshing at the time too. In the 2000s, we would get a metric ton of modern day shooters, especially in the free-to-play shooter department. But in the 90s, we would get mostly sci-fi and fantasy shooters since they provided more freedom for creativity, creating fantastical or abstract worlds where you didn't have to ground yourself in reality too much. But there were some exceptions, such as Half-Life, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, and a few others. Action Quake 2 combines John Woo's style of action with Quake 2's gameplay and blends it with a modern setting. This mod was so well received and popular at the time that id Software had stepped in and offered to include their mod in a mod pack they would release in '98, known as Quake 2 Netpack 1 Extremities. This mod pack would update the game to version 3.20, including a shareware version of the GameSpy 3D software, which was what Quake 2 relied on for its multiplayer. Action Quake 2 was one of the earliest semi-realistic multiplayer games released, a type of game where it would be at its core an arcade-based shooter, but with some elements of realism injected into it. As I said, Action Quake 2 would include recoil, which would affect the direction of your bullets, encouraging you to take your time with shots. Bleeding and injuries. Whenever you got shot in this game, you would be bleeding, and as a result, you would lose health. And the only way to stop that would be to bandage yourself. But that would also mean making you vulnerable to other players. So it would become a matter of either making your shots count before you die or risking it all to heal yourself. It was just enough realism to make the game a unique and refreshing experience, but not too much to suck the fun out of it completely. Locational damage was another factor. The damage output of your weapons would be affected by range as well as where you shot them. Counter-Strike would later on use the same idea, with headshots being the most effective. In this aspect, it makes the time to kill in this game much faster than in vanilla Quake 2, since precision was more of a priority here. The range of weapons ranged from revolvers to pistols, shotguns, rifles, submachine guns, grenades, sniper rifles, and even knives that you could throw or slash with. not to mention the attachments that you can find on the field like silencers and laser sights that would assist with aiming. For a mod based on Quake 2, the game was pretty in-depth, and there honestly wasn't anything like it at the time, not at least until Counter-Strike was released later after Half-Life. Speaking of which, some of the creative talent here would go on to work on other games. One such game would be Urban Terror, which is in a way Quake's own Counter-Strike, but that'll be for another video. But within Action Quake 2's development team would be two key figures that would end up being the creators of Counter-Strike, one of the most popular multiplayer shooters ever made, Min Lee and Jess Cliff. The two had worked together on Action Quake 2, and during that time, they would brainstorm the ideas for Counter-Strike, something that was more slower paced and tactical like Action Quake 2 was. So that same popular multiplayer shooter that has been going strong for 2 decades, the most played game on Steam, and one of the biggest esports games today, well, you have this game to thank for the foundations that it set, and bringing two people together to one day create Counter-Strike. While the game was a lot more popular back then, it would eventually get sidelined by Quake 3 and Counter-Strike, and as a result, would be mostly forgotten. But Action Quake 2 still thrives to some extent in Europe, most notably in parts of Sweden and Finland. There are still long-time veterans, and to my knowledge, still has an active fandom site known as AQ2 Sumi. They also have a Discord that you can join, provided that you can speak the language. As for elsewhere, the game is close to dead pretty much. AQ2 West was another fandom website that once existed but was eventually closed down. In the West, the game is, like I said, close to dead pretty much because of the existence of newer and more popular games, Counter-Strike being one of them. However, the game would get a release onto Steam for free, a standalone version that doesn't require Quake 2 at all, known as Action, with a Q that replaces the C. The game has servers that you can join, and you can occasionally find active matches, or join the Discord servers that host them. Otherwise, you do have bots to play around with if you're struggling to find a game with a good connection. Action Quake 2 is one of those lost pieces of history that most people have forgotten, but those that lived through the prime years of Quake 2 would most certainly know about this. It essentially paved the way for Counter-Strike, combined aspects of realism, but still keeping Quake's fast-paced gameplay. For a game of the 90s, it had some really unique mechanics and also a very unique setting, combining the idea of being in an action film, but within a modern-day setting in a fast-paced arena shooter. You would honestly be hard-pressed to find anything like that at all in the 90s, one that wasn't a fantasy or a sci-fi game. For those that are interested in Action Quake 2, I'll provide some links in the description, so you can check out the game that virtually birthed Counter-Strike. Thank you for watching.